And I'm just going to introduce you again real quickly. So our speaker for this month is Steve Stroh, N8GNJ, who is the editor of Zero Retries newsletter. And whenever you're ready, Steve, go ahead.
Okay. I apologize for the bare bones nature of my slide deck. Today was a busy day with Zero Retries, and I did not get enough time to put into it. Let's see.
Hello, it's Steve. Oh, how are you?
Let's see.
Yeah, this
Steve,
well, this time seems to be
Steve, thank you. Go ahead, other Steve.
Okay. Apologies. I have trouble finding the little button. Sorry, what are you seeing right now from my screen?
Yeah, we're seeing basically the presentation. It's not full screen, but we can read it all.
Boy, I got to get better at this. Apologies. So anyway, I just have some bullet points, and because most of what I do is extemporaneous, I did make a couple of notes. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me. And I am Steve Stroh, N8GNJ. I live in a little town called Bellingham, Washington, and pretty much in the upper northwest corner of the continental U.S. We're 10 miles from Canada, so very comfortable here right now. And my compliments to GSARA for their website. Just one tiny suggestion. Put in the website somewhere on the main page where exactly you guys are. Because, we're a worldwide society now, and anybody literally anywhere could look up your website, and it would help to know that you are in fact in New Hampshire, for those who aren't familiar with the Granite State terminology. Anyway, so this talk will be mostly about, it's the part of amateur radio that is not your grandfather's amateur radio. And I'll explain why that is as we go. A little bit of history about my newsletter, Zero Retries. It was Zero Retries. This is actually the second iteration of Zero Retries. The first one was a physical newsletter of the another organization I was involved with here in Puget Sound area when I was living down in Seattle, called the Northwest Amateur Packet Radio Association. And that organization has long since ceased, but the newsletter name was just too good not to use. So I resurrected it with the blessing of the person who had created the name. So I didn't used to be a writer about this kind of stuff. I was a happy consumer back in the day of packet radio. I happily read the Tapper Packet Status Register newsletter when it came in the mail. And I happily consumed content like from QST. There was this magical issue of QST in May 1995 that just, I rediscovered it a few months ago. And it was just amazing, the content that was packed into there about things that I write about in Zero Retries. But unfortunately, that's a thing of the past. There was actually a full-blown magazine for about a year called Packet Radio Magazine, which is a very, very obscure publication that I think I'm the only one who remembers it anymore. But fortunately, I had the physical copies of that magazine and it's now online. So I'll get to that in a little bit. But the reason I started Zero Retries was I was getting irritated that stuff that I cared about was not being reported out in the mainstream amateur radio publications. When it was reported, like a new development in, say, packet radio, it was treated as a one-off. Isn't that nice? Not a bigger picture perspective of what's really going on. So I was getting irritated about that it wasn't showing up. I was talking it up. And I was getting blank looks, like when I, talk to a fellow ham, and because they didn't have the shared context that I had about this stuff. So I was a writer once upon a time in the telecommunications industry, and this new interesting system called Substack came out to create newsletters, and I thought, I can't do any worse than what isn't being reported these days. So I decided to start my own newsletter, and you can go look at it, zeroretries.org, spell out zero, and it's free to subscribe, free as in beer. There is a paid option that Substack will show you first. Of course, they like to make money, but you don't have to do that. And the full entire content of Zero Retries is available in the free subscriptions, not just the paid. I'm going to put in a plug for the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, DLARC. This is a project of the Internet Archive. It's accumulating material from amateur radio organizations and individuals worldwide. There's now more than 140,000 individual items, newsletters, recordings, videos, software, etc. And I've done my part. I've shipped dozens of boxes and hundreds of pounds of paper. I am not exaggerating. I've weighed it. A box that would go to them is on the order of 45 pounds. It was packed. So one of the audiences I target Zero Retries at is the younger techies that are coming into amateur radio from places like, I'm going to blank on the name of the DEF CON. So it's not widely known that DEF CON, that the amateur radio is a part of conferences like DEF CON, but it is. There's an entire organization called Ham Radio Village that has a separate area at DEF CON and other conferences like DEF CON that talk about amateur radio as a way to be able to have on radio technology, not just computer technology or network technology. So folks that are coming in these kinds of venues have an IT background. They're curious about radio technology. They're seeing things like the Flipper Zero and Meshtastic, and that it gets them curious. And with the right exposure to amateur radio, they said, okay, cool. Literally at DEF CON, there were people that attended a presentation. The next day they took a VE test and they were hams. They want to hack on radios, which means the open source stuff and the software-based radio, the radios are more easily hacked on with software are the ones that they are really interested in. Things like being able to do long distance off-grid messaging and email is the stuff that resonates with them, not DXing, not contesting, not so much HF, although there is a fair amount of interest in HF just because of the nature that, radio to radio, thousands of miles, what's not to like? And they want to be able to use other bands. They know that, there's an awful lot of stuff out there, but really the only stuff they've been able to hack on so far is, 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz wireless LAN gear. So one of the biggest changes in amateur radio of late, excuse me, just a moment. There we go. I'm trying to have a timer run, and so this doesn't run too long because I can literally talk for hours about this stuff. So M17, you can go to m17project.org. And by the way, I will send a copy of this slide deck with links about this stuff. Apologies that I don't have it available in time to provide it to the club. M17project.org will get you the bare bones of the idea. It was essentially started as a amateur radio specific and open source everything, equivalent to DMR or System Fusion or D-Star. That is a digital voice system with repeaters, internet linking, and most importantly, data. To me, data. They started with a spec. They started building various bits and bobs, little MMDVM hotspots, etc. But it's now blossomed into an entire ecosystem of devices that are all M17 compatible. So you can build a repeater with a MMDVM multi-mode digital voice modem at the core of it. It's a typical FM repeater, and it will pass, among other things, D-Star, DMR, System Fusion, and even some other interesting modes like POXAG, the old alphanumeric paging standard, and M17. And one of the things that will be hopefully included in the MMDVM list of modes is a mode called MMDVM TNC, which will be 9600 bits per second, forward error correction, lots and lots of goodness. And that will, if that comes to pass, that will be my nerdvana perfect solution to what I want to see is being able to, for amateur radio repeaters, when they're quiet, which is most of the time these days, except for certain, repeaters that have a lot of traffic in active clubs, be able to pass data transparently, and real data, 9600 bits per second, or at least. And this spec conceivably could go a lot faster than that, probably 4 times as fast as 9600, but certainly 9600 and 19.2 kilobits per second. So anyway, M17 has pulled in an awful lot of folks that were either hams, but not very active in VHF, UHF, literally because they didn't want to be using proprietary technology. And they even consider, a system like D-Star that was designed for amateur radio to be proprietary because it has that proprietary codec embedded in it. So when they start seeing M17, they get interested immediately and said, oh, this is my kind of amateur radio because it's open source. I can dig into it. I can understand it. I can modify it. I can extend it. I can share it freely, etc. So M17 is a quiet force that's building in amateur radio, and just in time. Another system that I've been tracking in zero retries, and I'm just seeing an awful lot of interest. And again, this excites these newer amateur radio operators who are data centric. Excuse me for a second. I'm going to go. I had an annoying moving background, and so. ARDN is Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network, AREDN, and it is a different load of firmware for a lot of different devices for microwave networking. And they have done a fantastic job. The developers have done a fantastic job on this by creating an amateur radio-centric microwave networking system that happens to do mesh networking plug and play. And unlike any other system that I've seen in the wireless networking realm, this one really works. It really does. You just turn it on and it starts finding other nodes that are within range. You have to flash a device, and it's only a handful of devices with this new code. And among other things, it allows the transmission in the header of every packet that it transmits is your call sign, which is a requirement of amateur radio. And it turns off any encryption capabilities built into the units. So, and it meshes, it's got all the IP goodness that you need, like DNS and DHCP, et cetera, automatic assignment of unique IP addresses. It just works. And it is amazing how interesting this is to these new techies that have an IT background, because they don't get to play generally with outdoor gear unless they happen to work for a wireless ISP or a very big enterprise that does outdoor stuff. But a lot of this stuff gets assigned to the radio techs who climb towers, so they don't get to play with this. But ARDN lets them play with this and get up to speed on it. Another thing that we've been doing pretty much all along, but very few people have been paying attention to it, is APRS messaging. So every APRS system pretty much has this built in. that you can send messages through the APRS network, through digipeaters to other devices that are, on the same channel, within range of a digipeater, et cetera. It's been there, but it hasn't been very well used because it's built into things like the Kenwood THD 710A, which has a pretty big display, but you have to type the message in from the 12 or 16 button microphone keypad, which is just an absolute non-starter. So what's happened lately is that an application called Meshtastic, which uses a wireless data system called LoRa, has just taken the hobby communications folks by storm. You can go out and buy a LoRa device, flash Meshtastic onto it, and then be setting up a completely decentralized, independent mesh network for just messaging, basically. So they are just all over this and really happy, and they're experimenting, and they're putting up infrastructure like digipeaters as we understand them, and amateur radio looks old and tired by comparison because we've been doing APRS messaging, with our big D710 radios, not as easy. The thing about Meshtastic is that the application lives on the phone. So you've got, all the goodness and the power of the phone, and then it talks to the Meshtastic node with Bluetooth. And, so you're having a great time, exchanging messages back and forth from your couch using your phone. And it's a lot of fun. And we're stuck with radios and, portable radios that have APRS built in. They can display decently, but, entering messages is really bad. So we do have some apps that can do APRS messaging, like APRS.fi on iPhones and APRS Droid on Android devices. So we're getting there, but we need to be able to show off amateur radio's capabilities compared to Meshtastic. And this matters because a really good explanation I heard about Meshtastic was that Meshtastic is a gateway drug to show off amateur radio. I talked a little bit about MMDVM as a way to get modernize repeaters for digital capabilities, including digital voice and data. DigiPi is another very cool device. This was created by a YouTube content creator, KM6LYW Radio. It's a little board. It's a Raspberry Pi. DigiPi is the software load. It's basically a load of Linux that you just flash onto a SD card, plug it into a Raspberry Pi with a little bit of hardware. And that little bit of hardware was a little bit of a hurdle for folks to get over because they had to do a little bit of soldering directly to the pins of a Raspberry Pi Zero, et cetera. But it's now gotten easier. There's 3 options, and I just explored that not too long ago in Zero Retries. DigiPi is basically off the shelf. You order the hardware, you plug it on, you load the software, you're done, and plug it into a radio, of course, and then you're done. This is the kind of the ideal way to get started on data modes in amateur radio, because DigiPi, the key thing about DigiPi is that it was designed to be used split. The radio interface and the radio live in the corner, and you talk to it with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth from your device. And it's much easier to explain that paradigm instead of having to set up an entire desk, for your data activities with its own dedicated screen, its own dedicated keyboard, et cetera. So DigiPi is just a fantastic thing. And I will be writing a long article about how to get going on it, plug and play, all the bits. And it's another observation is that the younger generation hasn't gotten a chance to do a lot of soldering, so they're kind of uncomfortable with it. They love it when they get exposed to it properly, but just saying, oh, just solder up the cable, that's a non-starter for them. Another typical thing that I like covering in zero retries is these cool new radios that are kind of out of left field, like the SBITX. This is a 25-watt radio that you kind of build as a kit, or you can buy it completely assembled. It's up to you. It's open source. All the plans are out there for what you want to do, and it's based on a Raspberry Pi. There's a Raspberry Pi literally built into the radio. So you can run data modes on the radio, which is cool. That's my kind of HF. New Packet Radio is a new system, it's more than 5 years old now, but we can do pretty decent data rates within amateur radio and this is completely an amateur radio solution. It was designed by an amateur radio operator for amateur radio spectrum, especially at 430 megahertz. It's handicapped in the US. It's not a particularly efficient system. It achieves 1 megabit per second, which sounds pretty cool, but that requires a 1 megahertz channel. But again, this is an amateur radio system designed for amateur radio. We're unfortunately handicapped in the US in using this because we have these infamous symbol rates currently assigned to the VHF, UHF bands, which say you can't go any faster than 56 56,000 symbols per second. And the maximum channel size you can use on UHF is 100 kilohertz. But unless, of course, you're running television, which means if you call it an image transmission, then that doesn't apply. That restriction only applies to data modes. So this was a issue that the FCC asked for comments on. Myself and many others replied that basically the FCC should get out of the symbol regulation business and just focus on the channels, or not even focus on channel size on VHF, UHF. So just wipe out the symbol rates and wipe out the channel sizes, because there are plenty of other bits and pieces of the regulations that will, in my opinion, and even in the opinion of the ARRL, would rein in any abuse that would happen from large, somebody trying to, transmit 1 megahertz channels in 2 meters, for example. Digital television is something that you don't hear about in, popular amateur radio publications or et cetera, but it's going strong. It's amazing. It's very popular in Europe. And this uses digital television these days uses a standard that is used in satellite broadcasting. It's very robust. It's open. It's open spec. So there's lots of hardware out there. And you can do digital television in as little as, I think the smallest one is 1 megahertz. Smallest channel size is 1 megahertz for full motion digital, full quality digital television. I even saw in a newsletter today that a person is trying to create a new amateur digital television system that will operate full motion video in 100 kilohertz, which would be very, very cool. That would blow it wide open, in my opinion. And this stuff is so off the shelf these days that seems to me that there ought to be at least one digital amateur television repeater in every metro area. There's got to be a good place. Here in Seattle, we have 3 large transmitting towers on one particular hill, right smack in the middle of Seattle. And we have one big high rise. We ought to be able to get a DATV repeater, and the equipment to receive DATV is really, really cheap. So even if you don't have the wherewithal to get a directional antenna up and reasonable power into the repeater, you can still receive it and watch the fun. Another thing that I periodically beat the drum on in zero retries would be really cool to have a equivalent of and I'm going to fluff it again. QO 100, Qatar Oscar 100 in the Eastern Hemisphere, which is centered above Africa. And the Europeans just have a fantastic time with QO 100. So geostationary satellites orbit the Earth at the same rate that the Earth rotates. So they appear to be at a one single point in the sky. So you just, once you can get your antenna aimed, you can just, lock it down, bolt it down, and, check it once a year or so. We almost had one for the US, but that project fell through. We might get another shot at this thanks to our friends, the Canadians. They are members of the European Space Agency, and the European Space Agency has expressed an interest in putting a payload up for amateur radio that would be equivalent to, the concept, at least, of QO 100. QO, in a lot of ways, QO 100 is not an ideal satellite system. It uplinks on 2.4 gigahertz, downlinks on 10 gigahertz. A better system, in lots of people's opinion, would be uplinking on 5 gigahertz and downlinking on 10, with much wider channels and much more attention to data modes. But it is what it is. QO 100 is up there and it's usable now. So there's a possibility that we're going to get a you guys will certainly be in the footprint, because they're probably going to park it put this on a satellite that's parked over the Atlantic, so covering most of Europe and at least part of North America. So you guys are in great shape. Us on the left coast, not so much, but we'll see what happens. And I would just love the innovation that has happened. There's dozens of small companies that are making gear for QO 100. It's just the creativity is amazing. It's just having that resource always there all the time is just an amazing way to get people interested in amateur radio. And lastly, I'm going to mention that we amateur radio operators in the US have this amazing band at 902 to 928 megahertz that most people don't make a lot of use of, because they think of it as a junk band where there's lots of unlicensed use. For example, if you've got a water meter, a power meter, a gas meter, you've got a 902 megahertz radio in your household. If you have an Amazon device like a Ring doorbell, you also have 902 to 928. Amazon uses 902 to 928 for what's called their sidewalk network. And I wasn't, in my coverage of this, I wasn't quite willing to go. I was going to guess hundreds of millions, but the number of devices that are actively using 902 to 928 runs into the billions, because it's used for RFID tags, tolling systems, just literally thousands of devices. And 20 years ago, the FCC licensed a company that is now called NextNav to do what's called a location and monitoring service application, that basically they were allowed to deploy high power transmitters in this band, as long as they took care to not horribly interfere with other users of the band. So there's an uneasy, or a live and let live attitude about between amateur radio, the location and monitoring service, the industrial uses of 902 to 928, and all of these incredible number of unlicensed applications. NextNav has proposed in FCC docket 240 to completely reconfigure the band, basically crowd everybody into a small subset of the band and take it over for their own use for this location and monitoring service. But a lot of people have sussed out that their real motivation is to try and carve out a 5 megahertz channel that they can then turn around and sell or lease to various entities that want some cheap spectrum to do various communications things. This is actively in question or the request for comment stage, you can still go it. If you just just do a quick Google of FCC docket 24-240, you'll find out what I'm talking about. If you go back a few issues of zero retries, 2 weeks ago, I devoted an entire issue to this issue. We could lose. It's conceivable that we amateur radio could completely lose access to, effective access to 902 to 928. What we'd be left with would be essentially unusable, especially the FM repeaters that are using it from folks that don't have access to the 440 band because they're next to a paved paw radar, or they're don't have access to 1240 to 1300 because they're close to a system that uses that for government use. So that's a very brief pass of what the kind of stuff that I'm following in zero retries. And basically, the message I want to leave you with is that it's a shame that amateur radio is not being portrayed as this very dynamic, very techy, very interesting, very cool amateur radio, this service that, the techies can just wade in and really find many, many things to deal with. And these are just the things that I'm personally motivated to track and write about. And there's hundreds of others things that can be going on. I heard a reference to POTA. I said, POTA, physical radios, what's not to like? So especially, and there's a fair amount of folks that are showing up and doing POTA. They turn on the radio and let the radio do all the work, which, on data modes, which is my way to do that. So, so that's the end of my presentation. Probably went a little bit too long, but happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Yep. Does anyone have any? Yeah, I have at least one question here. Just bear with me here first. Well,
zero retry.
Yep. There's just a question of where the name zero retries actually originates. What is a zero retry, if you will?
Oh, so that's an old term from packet radio. So packet radio is the way the packet radio would work is you would transmit your packet with a checksum, and if the checksum was received okay, that was the perfect condition. You did not have to retry or resend the packet. But if the packet was received with a bad checksum, you would retry or resend the packet. So zero retries is perfect transmission.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Does anyone else have any? Oh, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yep.
Can you recommend any vendors for this various hardware to purchase?
Yes, if you go onto zeroretries.org, there's a top line menu item called Zero Retries Guides. And I don't remember exactly what I called it. It's Zero Retries Guide to Interesting Vendors. I think that'll give you a start. And then whenever I mention a vendor in the actual newsletter, there's almost always a link. So that's a good start. And what I really love about the folks that I love in there is that it seems like at least half of them are one-person businesses. So, and you don't get to hear about, and the main reason that I list them there is you don't get to hear about them in places like the HRO catalog or advertising in QST. They're just out there doing their thing and, hoping for word of mouth to let people know about their products.
I have a quick question for you, Steve. You actually made an M17 voice contact yet?
I have not, unfortunately.
Okay, fair enough. If you need help, let me know.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. I honestly, I start every week thinking that, oh, maybe this is the week I can get back to the workbench, and stuff just keeps pouring in to write about in zero retries. I literally said a couple of weeks ago that I was hoping that, things would slow down enough that I could, just phone it in for a couple of weeks with a best of, and stuff just keeps happening. Like today, like this week, there was a announcement of a new vendor who is now offering these really cool products to operate in, ironically enough, 902 to 928 megahertz. And it's amazing that you can get a radio that literally fits in half of the palm of my hand. It's called an M. The form factor is called an M2, and these are the and you can now get a Raspberry Pi adapter with an M2 slot on it and set up a radio that'll do 100 megabits per second on 902 to 928. Go for miles with a teeny antenna, and the stuff just blows me away. And they just announced their crowdfunding campaign this week. And so I couldn't not mention it in Zero Retries. So yeah, it's honestly, there's twice the stuff that doesn't make it into Zero Retries that I hear about, and I just cannot write fast enough. I'm old school. I actually do it with my digits instead of my voice, or get an AI assist, at least so far.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions for? I know there's a lot of stuff, and some of you may not have heard of a lot of it. I'll plug his newsletter again, zeroretries.org, where he'll talk about all the things that he's talked about and new stuff that comes along. I've been a reader of it for a while. It's where I normally find out about some of the cutting edge stuff. So, any further questions? Oh, we have a comment.
Pointing out that we don't say we're in New Hampshire, because I didn't know. I looked at it after you said that, and you're right. If you didn't know we were in the Granite State, then what the Granite State was, you wouldn't know where we were.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's a regional thing. I think we just kind of missed because we like the Granite State, as it were. So, but yes, thanks for pointing that out, Steve.
I thought you were going to make a reference. So a few about 6 issues ago or so, I happened to look at the stats page of Zero Retries, from the publishing system called Substack, and it gave me this really wacky, skewed perspective. There's more than 2,100 subscribers, and it said something to the effect that there were 1, 2, or 3 subscribers in all of New Hampshire. And I swear that I heard from all dozen or so, at least a dozen subscribers in New Hampshire says, hey, there's a lot more of us than that. So, apparently it gets passed around at, club meetings and stuff. And so, yeah, you guys were by far the most vocal of all the states that got, dissed.
That's right. We're a small state, but a proud state, Steve. So there you go.
Oh, you are indeed.
Yeah. Well, very good. So, is there any other questions for Steve before we wrap it up for the evening? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Steve, for the presentation. And I'm sure if folks were interested, they'll certainly check out your newsletter if they haven't. And you do a podcast now and again. Now, isn't that the Forward in Store?
Yeah. We so I mentioned the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, and I have a really good working relationship with the person who runs that, and I am just an absolute unabashed fanboy of DLARC, and I regularly do. In fact, I wrote an article for their blog that explained and said, one of the ways that I use DLARC is that I dive into the old technical articles, like the presentations from the Digital Communications Conference, and I look at stuff that was proposed back then that was leading edge or even bleeding edge of things that they tried to do back then, but they just didn't quite have the technology, or the technology wasn't cost effective, or et cetera. Like for once upon a time, we had these ideas for network node controllers in our packet networks, that, was dedicated hardware that you had to build, with processors and custom software. Now we just do this stuff with Raspberry Pis. So there's so much prior art out there In fact, one of the coolest things that I love about DLARC is that it has, with full permission from the family, the entire run of 73 magazine. Every bit of it's digitized, every bit of it is indexed, every bit of it is optical character recognition, so full text. Gets a little rough sometimes, the third or fourth generation of print, but it's all there, all 40 some years of publication there, and contrast that with a certain large publication that is hidden behind a paywall. 73 is much more about amateur radio than things that are hidden behind paywalls, because somebody who's trying to get into amateur radio can find, just browse through this stuff. They can think up a phrase, they can type it into DLARC, and they can find dozens of articles on any conceivable subject. It's in there. So sorry, long answer to a short question. So Kay Savitz, K6KJN, and I have a really good working relationship, and he proposed this idea called Store and Forward. So the store part of the podcast is him talking about what he's been doing up to lately in DLARC, and the forward is the kind of the leading edge stuff that I talk about in zero retries. So it's an interesting contrast, and Kay and I get along pretty well, and we do it every couple of weeks, when we can both fit it into our joint schedules, and it's now a real podcast. If you just look in Store and Forward, the big yellow logo is ours. There's another Store and Forward that I don't know anything about, but the one with the pretty yellow ampersand is ours. So I think we've done 5 episodes so far, and we keep it light, and we keep it terse, half hour or so.
Very good. Yep. Yeah. I've listened to the first couple. I started from the beginning, so I'm not caught up to current yet, but listened to a couple of them, and they are good. And I will echo what Steve says. If you go to the Internet Archive and look up the DLARC, there is tons of stuff. Read some old Wayne Green editorials, which are always fun and can still ring true today. It's all there, plus all sorts of stuff, newsletters from all sorts of clubs, all sorts of great material that won't get lost over time. It's now essentially permanently archived at archive.org. So very good. Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Steve, for the presentation.